In the shadowed streets of Victorian England, amid the industrial smoke and the clamor of rapid social change, the world was introduced to figures who would forever stain history with acts of unspeakable brutality. The era was one of progress and decay, a paradox of glittering wealth and grinding poverty, of new inventions and ancient fears. It was in this time of upheaval that the figure of the serial killer emerged with a chilling prominence, carving not only into the lives of their victims but also into the imagination of a society just beginning to grapple with the psychology of crime and the science of detection. While the modern understanding of serial killers as a distinct category of criminal would not be fully formed until much later, the Victorian age became the stage for some of the most terrifying and infamous cases in recorded history. These figures did not merely kill, they embodied the fears of a population already anxious about the shifting world around them. London was at the heart of this grim narrative. The metropolis had grown into a sprawling maze of alleys, tenements, factories, and marketplaces, where wealth and misery collided on the same streets. The Industrial Revolution had brought prosperity to some but poverty, overcrowding, and disease to many more. Within this fertile ground for despair, killers thrived. They exploited anonymity in crowded slums, the vulnerability of the poor, and the limited reach of law enforcement. The Victorian police, still finding their footing in the relatively new system of organized policing, faced not only practical challenges but also societal skepticism. Many citizens did not trust the police, and investigative techniques were primitive by modern standards. Fingerprinting had not yet been adopted, forensic science was rudimentary, and criminal psychology was in its infancy. It was a time when killers could move through the darkened streets largely unchecked, leaving communities terrified and authorities scrambling for answers. No discussion of Victorian serial killers can begin without mentioning Jack the Ripper. His name is now infamous, synonymous with mystery and terror, but in 1888 he was simply the terrifying specter stalking Whitechapel. The Ripper's victims were poor women, many of them sex workers, whose lives had already been marked by hardship before they were brutally ended. The murders were not only shocking for their violence but for their apparent purposelessness, the cold surgical nature of the mutilations, and the way the killer seemed to vanish into the fog after each strike. Newspapers of the time seized on the story, sensationalizing every detail and creating a frenzy of fear and speculation. Letters allegedly written by the killer taunted the police and the public, deepening the sense of helplessness. To this day, the Ripper's identity remains unknown, and the mystery has spawned countless theories. Yet beyond the theories and sensationalism lies the grim reality of women who became victims because they lived on the margins of society, ignored until their deaths forced the world to notice them. Jack the Ripper was not alone, though his fame often overshadows others who committed equally chilling acts. Consider Amelia Dyer, known as the baby farmer. In Victorian England, unwanted children were a tragic reality, and impoverished women often turned to women like Dyer who promised to care for infants in exchange for payment. What many did not know was that Dyer profited by murdering the very children entrusted to her. Over decades, she strangled or neglected countless babies, disposing of their bodies in rivers or shallow graves. Her crimes were motivated by greed, exploiting a society where illegitimacy carried a heavy stigma and desperate mothers felt they had no choice. When she was finally caught in 1896, investigators were horrified by the scale of her atrocities. She is believed to have killed hundreds of children, making her one of the most prolific serial killers in history. Her case highlighted the dangers faced by society's most vulnerable and the chilling way in which exploitation could turn to murder in a system riddled with neglect. Then there was Mary Ann Cotton, another name that lingers in the dark corners of Victorian history. Cotton was a woman whose crimes spanned decades and whose victims included her own children, husbands, and stepchildren. Arsenic was her weapon of choice, a poison easily obtainable in Victorian England, often sold for household use. She became infamous for poisoning those around her, collecting insurance payouts, or eliminating inconvenient family members. The deaths often appeared as mysterious illnesses, until suspicions grew as the bodies mounted. Cotton's crimes reflected a particular feature of the Victorian age, the accessibility of poisons, combined with limited medical understanding. Symptoms of poisoning could easily be mistaken for natural diseases, allowing killers like Cotton to operate in the shadows for years. Her eventual arrest and execution did not erase the terror that someone could so casually and systematically destroy the lives of those closest to her. Not all Victorian killers targeted family or strangers in shadowed alleys. Some, like William Palmer, were doctors who used their medical knowledge for sinister ends. Palmer, known as the Rugeley poisoner, was a respected physician whose life unraveled when suspicions arose about the sudden deaths of his wife, his brother, and even a friend who had won a large sum of money. Palmer's weapon was again poison, and his ability to hide behind his role as a doctor allowed him to avoid suspicion for years. His case was highly publicized, not only because of the horror of his crimes but also because it called into question the trust between doctor and patient, between society and the very people meant to heal. His trial was a spectacle, drawing crowds and dominating newspapers. The fascination with Palmer's crimes reflected a broader Victorian obsession with the macabre, a cultural curiosity about death, crime, and punishment that filled penny dreadfuls and serialized novels as much as it did courtrooms. The fascination with serial killers in Victorian England was not simply morbid curiosity. These cases struck deep chords because they revealed the fragility of life in a society undergoing rapid change. The killers themselves became symbols, embodiments of fears about morality, gender roles, class divisions, and even science itself. Jack the Ripper became a figure of fear not only because of his murders but because he represented the dangers lurking in the neglected, impoverished parts of London that wealthier citizens preferred to ignore. Amelia Dyer's murders were not only about the deaths of children but about the failure of society to protect mothers and infants. Mary Ann Cotton's poisonings were chilling reminders that the home, supposedly a place of safety, could be a place of deadly betrayal. The media played an enormous role in shaping the legacy of these killers. The Victorian press thrived on sensationalism, and stories of murder sold papers. Each new killing was described in lurid detail, and rumors spread faster than facts. The public's appetite for gruesome tales was insatiable, and the press obliged, often blurring the lines between truth and speculation. This had the effect of both terrifying and thrilling readers, feeding the growing cultural fascination with crime. The serialized narratives of real-life murders bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the popular fiction of the day, with villains, victims, and suspenseful twists. The difference, of course, was that the victims in these tales were real, their lives cut short by brutality. Law enforcement struggled to keep pace. The Metropolitan Police, only a few decades old, faced the challenge of investigating crimes in a rapidly growing city. The science of forensics was primitive, photography was still new, and fingerprinting would not be introduced until the early 20th century. Detectives relied heavily on eyewitnesses, confessions, and circumstantial evidence, often leading to miscarriages of justice. Yet the failures of the police also fueled public anger and fear, as in the case of Jack the Ripper, where the inability to catch the killer created widespread distrust. This distrust spilled over into broader anxieties about the role of government and institutions in protecting ordinary people. The killers themselves were not always viewed simply as monsters. Some Victorians, influenced by emerging ideas in psychology and criminology, saw them as products of their environment or even as specimens for scientific study. The Italian criminologist Cesare Lombroso's theories about the born criminal were widely debated, suggesting that some people were biologically predisposed to crime. While these ideas are now discredited, they reflect the era's attempt to make sense of behavior that seemed beyond comprehension. The Victorian serial killer was not only a criminal but a puzzle, a dark enigma that science and society alike struggled to decode. These figures left behind legacies that stretch far beyond their crimes. Jack the Ripper remains a cultural icon, inspiring countless books, films, and theories. His mystery is enduring as the foggy streets he once haunted. Amelia Dyer's case helped bring about changes in adoption and childcare laws, highlighting the dangers of unregulated baby farming. Mary Ann Cotton's poisonings contributed to greater awareness about the sale and use of arsenic, eventually leading to tighter regulations. William Palmer's trial forced a re-examination of medical ethics and trust in the medical profession. In these ways, the crimes of Victorian serial killers shaped not only public fear but also the evolution of law, medicine, and social policy. Yet beyond the societal impacts, it is important to remember the victims. Too often, the names of killers are remembered while the lives they destroyed fade into obscurity. The women of Whitechapel were not merely victims of Jack the Ripper but individuals with histories, struggles, and hopes. The children murdered by Amelia Dyer were human lives cut short before they could even begin. The husbands and children poisoned by Mary Ann Cotton lived and loved before their lives were betrayed. The friends and family members of William Palmer trusted him before he betrayed that trust in the most profound way. Behind every headline and every sensationalized tale lies the true horror: ordinary people whose lives ended violently, often without justice. Victorian England was a time of immense change, of scientific discovery, social reform, and industrial progress. But within its shadows, killers thrived, exploiting the vulnerabilities of the age. Their crimes were magnified by the anxieties of a society caught between tradition and modernity, between superstition and science. In many ways, the fascination with these killers continues because they embody timeless fears: the fear of the unknown, the betrayal of trust, the predator lurking in the darkness. The Victorian age gave birth to a new kind of criminal, one who would haunt both history and imagination, leaving behind a legacy of fear, fascination, and sorrow. The dark history of Victorian serial killers is not simply a catalogue of crimes but a reflection of an age where progress and horror walked hand in hand. These stories remind us that even in times of great advancement, human cruelty can thrive in the shadows. They remind us that every victim was a life stolen, every crime a rupture in the fragile fabric of society. And they remind us that while killers may be remembered for their brutality, the true weight of history lies in the silent voices of those who were lost. The Victorian serial killer is both a figure of fear and a mirror held up to an age that, for all its grandeur, was haunted by darkness. 1. The social and cultural backdrop of Victorian England: industrial progress alongside poverty, crime, and slums. Victorian England was a paradoxical age where dazzling progress coexisted with staggering misery. The Industrial Revolution transformed cities like London, Manchester, and Birmingham into bustling centers of trade and innovation. Railways, factories, and gaslight illuminated the age, yet beneath this modernity lay overcrowded slums, rampant disease, and poverty that crushed the working class. In the labyrinth of dark alleys, desperation bred crime, prostitution, and violence. The rigid class divide meant the wealthy lived in relative safety while the poor were left vulnerable. This stark environment created the perfect breeding ground for predators who could hide among the masses, preying on society's most marginalized. 2. The rise of sensationalist media and its role in shaping fear of serial killers. Victorian newspapers thrived on sensationalism, and nothing captured public attention like tales of blood and mystery. The press reported murders with lurid details, often exaggerating or speculating when facts were scarce. Readers devoured penny dreadfuls, cheap serialized publications filled with crime and horror, that blurred the line between fiction and reality. In the case of Jack the Ripper, newspapers printed letters allegedly from the killer, whether authentic or fabricated, to stir hysteria and sell copies. This relentless coverage spread fear far beyond the neighborhoods where crimes occurred. Serial killers became not just criminals but figures of cultural terror, magnified through the growing power of mass media. 3. Jack the Ripper and the Terror in Whitechapel in 1888. The autumn of 1888 saw East London's Whitechapel district gripped by unspeakable fear. Jack the Ripper, an unidentified killer, brutally murdered and mutilated at least 5 women, most of them prostitutes. The violence of the attacks shocked even hardened Londoners, as the killer displayed surgical precision and seemingly taunted the police. Each new discovery of a body sent shockwaves through the community. The fact that the killer was never caught only deepened the mystery, making him a symbol of unstoppable evil. His crimes epitomized the vulnerability of the poor and the inability of the authorities to protect them, cementing his name in dark history. 4. The lives and struggles of the Ripper's victims, often marginalized women. Behind the sensational stories were real women: Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, whose lives tell a story of hardship in Victorian London. They lived in overcrowded lodging houses, worked menial jobs, and often turned to prostitution as a last means of survival. Society largely ignored them until their deaths forced them into the spotlight. Their murders highlighted not only the brutality of Jack the Ripper but also the neglect of a system that failed to protect the poor and vulnerable. Remembering their humanity challenges the tendency to focus solely on the killer rather than the lives he destroyed. 5. Amelia Dyer, the baby farmer, and her exploitation of vulnerable mothers. In a society where illegitimacy carried heavy shame and poverty left mothers with few options, women like Amelia Dyer offered a deadly solution. Dyer presented herself as a caretaker for unwanted infants, promising adoption and a better life. In reality, she strangled or neglected the children, disposing of their bodies in rivers or hidden places. Her crimes spanned decades and may have claimed hundreds of lives, making her one of history's most prolific killers. When she was finally exposed in 1896, the horror shocked the nation, revealing how social neglect and stigma enabled monstrous exploitation of society's most defenseless. 6. Mary Ann Cotton, Britain's first recognized female serial killer, and her use of arsenic poisoning. Mary Ann Cotton built her murderous career on the accessibility of arsenic, a poison commonly found in Victorian homes. She poisoned her husbands, children, and stepchildren, often collecting insurance money or freeing herself from unwanted family ties. Over 2 decades, she left a trail of suspicious deaths that were initially dismissed as natural illnesses. The repeated pattern eventually raised suspicions, leading to her arrest and execution in 1873. Cotton's case exposed how easy it was for domestic killers to operate undetected in an age when medical science struggled to distinguish poisoning from disease, turning the Victorian household into a hidden crime scene. 7. William Palmer, the Rugeley poisoner, a doctor who betrayed medical trust. William Palmer's crimes struck at the heart of public trust in medicine. A respected physician in Rugeley, he became infamous when suspicions arose about the deaths of his wife, his brother, and even a racing friend who had recently won a large sum of money. Palmer used poison, a weapon he understood well, hiding behind his medical authority to deflect suspicion. His trial in 1856 was a national sensation, drawing vast crowds and dominating headlines. His betrayal of the doctor-patient relationship shook Victorian society, raising unsettling questions about how easily knowledge meant to heal could be twisted into a deadly tool. 8. Thomas Neil Cream, the Lambeth poisoner, who targeted women with strychnine. Thomas Neil Cream was a Canadian-born doctor who brought terror to London in the 1890s. Known as the Lambeth poisoner, he lured women, often sex workers, with promises of medical treatment before administering strychnine, a poison that caused agonizing deaths. His murders displayed a predatory pattern of targeting society's vulnerable while using his medical background to disguise his crimes. Cream's arrogance contributed to his downfall, as he openly boasted about his killings, leading to his capture and execution in 1892. His case, alongside Palmer's, reinforced public anxieties about doctors abusing their authority and demonstrated how poison became the killer's weapon of choice. 9. Frederick Bailey Deeming, murderer and suspected Ripper candidate. Frederick Bailey Deeming was a conman and murderer whose crimes spanned continents. In England, he murdered his wife and children, burying them beneath the floorboards, before fleeing abroad. Later killings in Australia further exposed his brutality. His pattern of deceit, multiple identities, and violent murders made him notorious worldwide. Some even speculated that Deeming could have been Jack the Ripper, given his presence in London at the time and his history of targeting women. Though evidence remains inconclusive, his case exemplified the way Victorian killers often lived double lives, moving between respectability and savagery while evading authorities in an era of limited international policing. 10. The role of arsenic and other accessible poisons in Victorian killings. Poison was the silent weapon of Victorian murderers, widely available and difficult to trace. Arsenic in particular was used in rat poison, household cleaning products, and even cosmetics, making it easy to purchase without suspicion. Symptoms of arsenic poisoning, vomiting, diarrhea, and abdominal pain, closely resembled natural illnesses, complicating detection. Murderers like Mary Ann Cotton exploited this ambiguity to kill repeatedly without raising alarms. The ease of obtaining poisons, coupled with limited forensic methods, turned them into the weapon of choice for domestic and calculated killings. Over time, notorious cases forced stricter controls on sales, but not before many lives were lost. 11. The failure and limitations of Victorian policing and forensic science. Policing in Victorian England was still a developing institution. The Metropolitan Police had only been established in 1829, and detectives were often mistrusted by the public. Forensic science was primitive. Blood typing, fingerprinting, and DNA analysis did not exist. Investigators relied heavily on eyewitness testimony, confessions, or circumstantial evidence. In the Ripper case, despite enormous publicity and police presence, the killer slipped away each time. Such failures eroded public confidence in law enforcement, leaving communities vulnerable. The inability to catch or even understand these killers showed the limits of Victorian justice and created a sense of helplessness in the face of calculated murder. 12. The emergence of criminology and early theories about born criminals. As Victorian society struggled to understand these new kinds of murderers, criminology emerged as a field. Thinkers like Cesare Lombroso argued that criminals could be identified by physical traits, suggesting that some were born criminals. Though now discredited, such theories reflected the era's attempt to explain what seemed inexplicable. The fascination with serial killers intersected with debates about science, morality, and heredity. Were these killers products of their environment, victims of poverty and neglect, or were they inherently evil? The unanswered questions deepened society's fear while also fueling academic interest, laying the groundwork for modern criminology and forensic psychology. 13. Public distrust of institutions, fueled by high-profile murder cases. Every unsolved murder and every failed investigation added fuel to a growing distrust in Victorian institutions. Jack the Ripper's elusiveness humiliated the police and led to riots and protests in Whitechapel, where residents felt abandoned. When killers like Amelia Dyer or Mary Ann Cotton operated undetected for years, the public wondered how many others might be escaping justice. Doctors, clergy, and even family members, pillars of trust, were exposed as potential predators. These betrayals eroded the social fabric, making people suspicious not just of strangers in dark alleys but also of those closest to them, deepening the pervasive atmosphere of paranoia. 14. The Victorian obsession with death, crime, and punishment in literature and popular culture. Victorian culture was steeped in fascination with death. Mourning rituals were elaborate, cemeteries grand, and literature often macabre. Crime stories became a popular form of entertainment, with penny dreadfuls, serialized novels, and plays dramatizing real murders. Charles Dickens and Wilkie Collins wove crime into their works, reflecting societal anxieties. Public executions, though declining, still drew enormous crowds, turning justice into spectacle. Serial killers fit perfectly into this cultural landscape, blurring the line between horror fiction and grim reality. The more gruesome the details, the more captivated the public became, making murder not only a tragedy but also a form of mass entertainment. 15. The social invisibility of victims, often women, children, and the poor. The victims of Victorian serial killers were often the forgotten and voiceless of society. Women forced into prostitution, impoverished children, and the elderly were easy prey. Their disappearances and deaths rarely drew attention until a killer's actions reached sensational proportions. In the case of Jack the Ripper, it was only the brutality of the murders that made the world notice women otherwise invisible to the public eye. Amelia Dyer's victims, countless infants, represented lives dismissed as disposable by a society unwilling to confront the stigma of illegitimacy. This invisibility made them targets and ensured their killers could operate longer without fear of discovery. 16. The intersection of crime with gender, morality, and class anxieties. Serial killings in Victorian England struck at deeper societal tensions about gender and class. Women killers like Mary Ann Cotton and Amelia Dyer challenged traditional expectations of female nurturing, becoming terrifying symbols of betrayal within the home. Male killers such as Jack the Ripper targeted poor women, fueling debates about morality, prostitution, and the dangerous classes. The crimes exposed the vulnerability of the lower classes while reinforcing upper-class fears of urban disorder. These killings were not just individual acts of violence but reflections of broader anxieties about shifting gender roles, urban poverty, and the fragility of Victorian social order. 17. The impact of high-profile trials and executions on public opinion. Victorian murder trials were often theatrical spectacles, drawing massive crowds and dominating newspapers. The trials of William Palmer, Mary Ann Cotton, and Amelia Dyer became public events where ordinary citizens followed every detail. Executions, though moving away from public squares, remained symbolic closures to these sagas. The hangings of notorious killers were presented as moral lessons, reaffirming justice, yet also fed the public's hunger for drama. These events influenced opinion about crime, punishment, and morality, often leading to debates in Parliament. Trials and executions became more than legal proceedings, they were cultural phenomena shaping the nation's consciousness of justice and evil. 18. Legal and social reforms prompted by these cases, e.g., childcare laws, poison regulation. The horror of serial killings sometimes spurred real change. Amelia Dyer's baby farming crimes led to reforms in adoption and foster care, with stricter regulations to protect infants. Mary Ann Cotton's use of arsenic prompted tighter controls on the sale of poisons. The failures to catch Jack the Ripper inspired advances in policing, detective work, and eventually forensic science. Each case exposed gaps in the system, forcing lawmakers and reformers to address the vulnerabilities that killers exploited. While reforms could not undo the tragedies, they demonstrated how even the darkest crimes could push society toward progress in law and social welfare. 19. The enduring cultural fascination with Victorian killers, especially Jack the Ripper. Even more than a century later, the killers of Victorian England captivate imaginations. Jack the Ripper has become a cultural icon, the subject of countless books, films, and theories. The fascination lies partly in the mystery. An unsolved case invites endless speculation, but also in the way his crimes embody fears of the unknown predator in society. Others like Amelia Dyer and Mary Ann Cotton remain subjects of documentaries and studies, reflecting ongoing curiosity about how such atrocities were possible. The combination of mystery, brutality, and historical distance makes these killers endlessly compelling, keeping Victorian dark history alive in modern culture. 20. The lasting legacy of Victorian serial killers is both historical figures and cultural myths. The legacy of Victorian serial killers lies at the crossroads of history and myth. They were real people who committed horrifying crimes, yet over time their stories have taken on a legendary quality. Jack the Ripper has become more myth than man, a symbol of evil whose true face is lost to time. Others, like Cotton and Dyer, represent cautionary tales about the dangers of neglecting society's vulnerable. Their crimes changed laws, influenced literature, and shaped how modern society understands serial killers. Ultimately, they remind us that progress and darkness can exist side by side, leaving haunting echoes for generations.